spending this high and political donations limited to the elite, raising and spending of money in elections, as we know po, has implications beyond election day.
Yung paggastos sa eleksyon ay parang pagnenegosyo. At yung mag-i-invest sa'yo, hindi naman syempre nag-i-invest lang yan na walang hinihintay na kapalit. So gusto niyan kumita, bumalik yung capital niya, at kumita. It always relates to good governance, how much candidates spend in our election.
Hindi namin sinasabi necessarily masama yung mga nagdo-donate, no? In fact, in other countries, yung pag-donate at pag-contribute sa political sa eleksyon, no? Eh, isang public good yan. Oh, ang sinasabi lang natin, transparent kung sino yung nag-donate. Para at least alam mo, transparency and disclosure might be very important. Sometimes more important than yung mga yung mga prohibitions and regulations, because you would want people to be more informed when they make their choice.
From the nation's capital, all sides, all the time, I'm Robbie Alampay.
And I'm Gretchen Ho. The big story tonight.
The Philippine Center for Investigative Journalism has released its initial findings on the top campaign spenders during the 2022 elections.
5 of these candidates spent over 2 billion pesos on ads that aired before and during the campaign period. Mobile journalist Jacob Lazaro gives us a front seat to the big story.
In its initial findings, the Philippine Center for Investigative Journalism found Senators Joel Villanueva, Mark Villar, Alan Peter Cayetano, former Vice President Leni Robredo, and former Manila Mayor Isko Moreno as the top spenders on mainstream media ads in the 2022 elections. Based on media monitoring agency Nielsen data, each of them spent an indicative total ad value of over 2 billion pesos before and during the official campaign period.
So this demonstrates how expensive it has become to run for public office in the Philippines.
Among vice presidential candidates, it was Sara Duterte and former Senator Tito Soto who spent the most with over 600 million pesos each. Ironically, for senatorial bets, most voted Robin Padilla and Raffy Tulfo were among those who spent the least with less than 300 million pesos. And as for social media or Facebook ads, it was Robredo who topped the list, spending more than 58 million pesos.
Although the bulk of the ads were paid by her supporters on the platform.
The PCIJ, though, admitted that there are limitations with their data. First, the actual expenditure could be lower, since the Nielsen data is based on the general rate cards of advertisers. Meanwhile, the statements of contribution and expenditures showed President Bongbong Marcos receiving the most campaign donation.
The total donation received by Marcos is the largest in history, and this is due in part to the raised allowable limit.
They also noticed that all presidential candidates except for Marcos Jr. received lower donations this elections compared to 2016. The PCIJ and other election watchdogs admit that the data they have right now doesn't capture the entirety of campaign spending.
We need to take a look if the spending done by candidates and political parties in the different online platforms was captured by the sources that they submitted to Congress.
With this, the group said it's high time to update our election laws to keep up with the inflation and institutionalize transparency.
Gusto mong nakasulat at naging mas maayos at alam ng taong bayan lalo na kung sino ang nagbabankroll sa mga kandidato. Kasi pwedeng maging bahagi ito ng pagpili ng taong bayan.
Mobile journalist Jacob Lazaro, we are One News.
Here to talk more about the campaign ad spending during the May 2022 elections, we have with us NAMFREL Acting National Chairperson Lito Averia Jr. and Lente Executive Director Ona Caritos. Mr. Averia, Attorney Caritos, welcome to the big story.
Yeah, thank you very much for having us here.
Thank you, and good evening, Robbie and Gretchen.
And thank you for being here. Mr. Averia, let me start with you. By tomorrow, people will be looking at the headlines. Most likely, the headlines will be looking at the simple rankings and so on. But two basic things. One is PCIJ stressed that this is just the initial findings. So, ang unang tanong ko po is, what are the important things that we don't actually know from this report, and what are the things that we don't actually know about actual election spending?
Well, one thing is, these are just based on ads, right? The Nielsen report. Okay, these are just the initial numbers that we're seeing. We still have to get the copies of the statement of contributions and expenses from COMELEC, which is part of our request, from the COMELEC, so that we can study the election spending in 2022.
And Attorney Garritos, just so we have some baseline and some framework, so people also understand beyond the ratings and the rankings, are there any violations here? Ano bang mga standards ang binabantayan natin dito in terms of spending? Is there a ceiling? Is there a cap? Are there lines that should not be crossed?
Remember, there are spending limits provided in our election legal framework for campaign finance. Just to give an example, for the presidential and vice presidential candidates, they're only allowed to spend 10 pesos per registered voter. So in the last elections, we had 67 million registered voters. So for those who ran for the president and vice presidential positions, they're only allowed to spend for a maximum of 670 million pesos in the last election.
And yet we are seeing billions of pesos in campaign spending for the candidates. Is there a correlation on election spending and election results that we're seeing? And specifically related to which platform they actually spend on?
Well, for one, the spending limit is limited to during the campaign period. Right, the pre-election expenses that we saw, there were a lot of postings, let's say on social media, ads everywhere. No, that was not included. It's not covered by the 10 pesos per registered voter. Okay, we can see surmise from the data that's provided us that there's no direct correlation. So, for example, Marcos spent less than the top two spenders, right? And yet he got the post.
So would you say we have a blind spot when it comes to digital ads and digital spending, given that I think we're tracking just the Facebook ad spending, and President Bongbong Marcos isn't even in the top 10?
Yeah, that's still a blind spot. No? It's if you're looking at Facebook only, but there are other platforms like Twitter and Instagram, and of course, the favorite platform today is TikTok, right?
Just to add, Robbie and Gretchen, to what Sir Lito said and answered your question, you have to remember that in this election, only Meta allowed political advertising in their platform. Google did not allow political advertising, Twitter and TikTok during the campaign period. So we have to take a look. The blind spot in our elections is the use of micro-influencers. Because most of the time, the payment to these micro-influencers, they're not reported in the sources filed by our candidates and political parties. Because most of the time, ang palabas ng mga micro-influencers is that they are supporters of the political party or the candidate.
Attorney Garritos, Mr. Averia, is it fair, therefore, to say that notwithstanding, as I said, all the headlines, all the memes that will be made, everything that people will be talking about with this report, is it nonetheless fair to say that actually one of the big stories here is we still actually don't know what candidates are spending?
Yeah, that would be an accurate assessment. No, you have to produce content, and to produce content, then you have to support it with funds, right? So, like Anna just mentioned, or you just mentioned the creation of memes, for example. That's just a small piece of content, but you can have a lot of those memes going around. You know?
Attorney Caritos, every election, it seems to be not just about regulating spending. Ultimately, it's about trying to regulate campaigns and the behavior of campaigns and candidates. But always, when we talk about candidates, it tends to be defined basically by deadlines, no? Filing of candidacies. It's also defined by dates, start of the election season, for example, the end of the election season. And always the question is, how do you regulate something that essentially is undefined? What is a better way for us to define who is a candidate and when has that candidate started to campaign?
I think the easiest way for all of us is to just go back to the old definition of a candidate. In the Omnibus Election Code, a candidate is defined as someone who has filed his or her certificate of candidacy. It doesn't have a colloquial right now that that person becomes only an official candidate at the start of the campaign period. So the period from the time that the COC is filed up to the time the official campaign period starts is covered by going back to the old definition. And what we saw from the PCIJ data is that during this time, most of the candidates, the top two candidates, spend almost the same amount as they spent in the official campaign period. So there's really a need to cover and go back to the old definition of a candidate under the Omnibus Election Code.
But that's backed now by a Supreme Court decision, hindi po ba? And the other thing, so how do you untangle that? That's, I guess, that's one question. But I think ang tanong din parati ng mga tao is, what about yung, alam naman natin lahat, namumulitika na, nagkakampanya na, before filing, in fact, 2 years before pa lang, alam na natin kung sino yung mga tumatakbo. What about that?
Well, that Supreme Court decision is brought about by the passage of the revised automated election law, or RA 9369. So there's just really a need for Congress to just amend RA 9369 and go back to the old definition of a candidate. And going back to your question, Robbie, na 2 taon naman nangangandidato na yung mga yan or nangangampanya na, well, we can't do anything about it because at the end of the day, the right to run for running for public office is a right enjoyed by all Filipino citizens. We just need to ensure that around election time or the time that the candidates file or individuals file their COC, all of them are at a level playing field. Walang lalamang na porke marami kang pera during this time ay mas marami kang lalabas na. So dapat covered lahat ng spending from the time you file your COC.
Right, maraming salamat, NAMFREL Acting National Chairperson Lito Averia Jr. and Lente Executive Director Ona Caritos. Join us in the conversation. Our big question tonight, how should election spending be regulated? Share your thoughts on our Facebook and YouTube live stream or post a tweet with the hashtag #TheBigStory. We'll be reading some of your comments later on in the program.
After the break, the Commission on Audit is flagging the poor implementation of the free Wi-Fi program of the DICT during the previous administration. We'll be speaking with DICT Secretary Ivan John Uy when the big story returns, so keep it here on One News.
Produce more rice than all time. No part of our country will be neglected. Progress will be made wherever there are Filipinos, so no investment is wasted. What we teach in our schools, the materials used must be rethought. I am not talking about history. I'm talking about the basics, the sciences, sharpening theoretical aptitude and imparting vocational skills, such as in the German example, alongside the national language, with equal emphasis and facility in a global language, which we had and lost. Our teachers from elementary up fighting ignorance with poor paper weapons. Once we had an education system that prepared coming generations for more and better jobs. There is hope for a comeback. Vice President and soon-to-be Secretary of Education, Sara Duterte Carpio, will fit that mission to a T.
The Commission on Audit is flagging the poor implementation of the DICT's Free Public Internet Access Program, or the Free Wi-Fi for All. Here's what we know. The Free Wi-Fi program was initiated by the DOST ICT office in 2015. COA flagged low rates of accomplishments for the program in its first 3 years of implementation due to procurement delays and difficulty in securing permits. The Commission also noted that in 2021, the department allocated 10.3 billion pesos for the program, but only around 2,900 sites out of the over 15,000 sites were still operational by the end of the year.
Here to talk to us more about this issue, we have with us Information and Communications Technology Secretary Ivan John Uy. He is standing in the middle of a parking lot. He tells us, joining us online via Zoom, testament to the ICT structure in the Philippines right now. Welcome to the big story, Secretary Uy.
Thank you, Robbie, and thank you, Gretchen. Good evening.
Ganda mo ng lighting.
Secretary Uy, notwithstanding our gratitude for your perseverance and bukang your stable connection in the middle of that parking lot, please do tell us about this, what COA is flagging. Tell us about this free Wi-Fi program. What do we need to know about it, and what do we need to know about why it's been under-delivered?
Well, as you know, the previous administration launched this free Wi-Fi program. This is intended to deploy the Wi-Fi and internet technology to the remote areas as well as the provinces in the provinces and municipalities all over the country. So this was funded, and it was supposed to be deployed all over the country. However, as I recently found out in my 2 weeks in the office, the COA has actually flagged this project because of poor implementation and poor utilization of the funding. So I'm looking at it right now, and there are many areas that need to be addressed. So the challenge there really is the DICT is a 6-year-old department, and it had 4 secretaries that headed this department. So that's where I think the crux of where all these inefficiencies and implementation shortfalls lie, because you had 4 leaderships going through a period of 6 years.
So birthing pains, problems with continuity, problems with getting the DICT itself off the ground. But in terms of the actual execution, you said that there are a number of factors. What are some major, just one or two major factors that you also think is one, easy to identify, but also more importantly, easy to fix?
Well, one of the identified problems there was that the bidding was broken up. A provider provides the equipment that will be located in the local government or the school or the barangay, and another contractor is given the contract to provide the last mile connectivity, and the third provider is given the contract for the middle mile connectivity. So these three different contractors have to work together, and they have to be implemented together for the whole Wi-Fi system to work. So what happens is that the contractor for the equipment has already finished their end and fully equipped the site, but your last mile contractor has not yet activated or turned on the last mile segment, while your middle mile is already done. So you still won't have any signals because a segment of the tripartite implementation is missing. And that is seen all over the place.
Naalala ko tuloy yung mga sa mall na meron kang signal ng Wi-Fi and then you connect and then you're not able to get internet. And that leads to a lot of frustration from people and also a lot of excitement for the rumors regarding Elon Musk's Starlink launch in the Philippines. Any updates on that? And are we expecting more foreign players coming in?
Yes, Gretchen. With the Public Service Act being signed, public utilities are now open for investment. And so we welcome investors to come in and to provide more competition to the industry. So you mentioned the low Earth orbit satellite of Starlink of Elon Musk is one of those first players to come in. And they're already briefing us on their projected implementation. And we're hoping that we should have gradual coverage of the country over the next year. It will most likely start in the northern part of the country, but hopefully, if schedules all work out right, we should be able to have it within the year.
And Secretary, Starlink would potentially come in under a commercial arrangement, but prior to that, a lot of people were really had high on their minds Facebook's program with the government, not necessarily strictly commercial, a commercial arrangement. But whatever happened to that? Is that already online?
Actually, not quite. The landing station in Baler, Quezon, is already done. And we're now laying out actually the cable from Baler to Poro Point, La Union. This was contracted and implemented by PCDA. So there are some civil works issues that have to be addressed here. Approximately about less than 2 kilometers of lines are rather troublesome. And we've already informed PCPA, and they are going to require the contractors to either replace the lines or repair the lines so that they will become live. Once that is done...
Yes, sorry.
Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead, Secretary.
Once that is done, then we'll connect it now to the national grid that will connect the backbone. Our first phase is from Ilocos to Quezon City, and we're hoping that that can go live within the next year or year and a half.
Secretary, wait, final question na lang. I hope you don't mind this follow-up, but I picked up on that verb. You said replace civil works issues. What does that mean? Does that mean that something was placed that needs to be replaced? Because we've been hearing about this project for quite some time already.
Yes, actually, because the contractor, when they laid the cable, there was no proper coordination with the DPWH. So what happened was after laying out the cable, the DPWH had some laying out of water pipes. And what happened was when they dug up the road, it cut off the cables of the fiber optic cables.
Yeah.
So that could not be used anymore.
Yeah, Secretary, I mean, I don't mean to make light of this. It's a very serious thing, of course, for a lot of people needing to connect. It has implications for education, for commerce, and so on. Pero parang sa labas lang ng subdivision namin. But I mean, quick question lang, is this one point? Is this multiple points? And when did this happen?
Actually, it happened during the last administration, and it has not been resolved until today. So we are communicating with the contractor. Our contractor actually is BCDA. The funds were downloaded to BCDA for implementation because I believe it's going to go through some areas that are within the jurisdiction of BCDA. So they were the ones who hired the contractor. And we had to relay this to them, and they have to enforce this on the contractor to repair this line. But as far as I understand, it should be done in the next few months.
Okay, maraming salamat po, DICT Secretary Ivan John Uy. More stories after the break. Keep it here on One News, all sides, all the time.
when oil prices are surging?
Well, good morning, Haslinda, and good morning, Rich. We economists don't talk of weak or strong peso. We talk of competitive currency. And so, as shown by David, the peso has depreciated together with other currencies, and in fact, we have depreciated much less than the other currencies. The weaker peso, or what we call depreciated peso, would mean, of course, higher oil bills, for example, and that because we are an oil importing country, but it also helps our exporters, make exports more competitive, helps our overseas Filipino workers. On the other hand, it imposes penalties on those consumers who prefer imported goods, like what I call the Ferragamo crowd.
You're still watching The Big Story here on One News. Let's now take a look back at our big question tonight. How should election spending be regulated? Here's what netizens had to say. For Marcelo, sitting commissioners are partly to blame for overspending or other violations committed by candidates. To address this, he suggests changing the qualifications and the systems for appointing COMELEC commissioners.
Alan, meanwhile, believes that candidates should be required to first submit their statements of assets, liabilities, and net worth before filing their certificates of candidacy. He says campaign financiers should also be banned. And you may also continue to join us in the conversation. Simply use the hashtag #TheBigStory and follow us on Twitter and Facebook at OneNewsPH. Like earlier, comments or tweets will be featured as part of our agenda to include you, the public, in our big story. And that's the big story tonight. For more updates, follow News 5, the Philippine Star, and Business World online. You may also log on to onenews.ph for more in-depth analysis. I'm Robbie Alampay.
The Big Story is also available via Signal Play app. Make a free account now at signalplay.com and stream One News anytime, anywhere. I'm Gretchen Hall. Mask on, wash hands, and stay safe, Philippines.
We are One News, all sides, all the time.